So all alone.
Welcome to the post-war era. The sun was setting on a beautiful afternoon as David, a middle school boy at the time, kicked a soccer ball down the road as he made his way home from school. David was somewhat of a recluse and had a bit of trouble making friends. Well, luckily for David, he saw a boy about his age leaning on a fence near the intersection in front of him. In an attempt to invite the boy to play, David kicked the soccer ball at his feet. But the boy's reaction wasn't what Dave expected. The boy barely moved. In fact, he barely reacted to the ball bouncing off his very own feet. Suddenly, the boy looked up at David, and that's when things started to get really weird. David couldn't help but notice the boy was oddly dressed. He wasn't dressed in the regular striped t-shirt, blue jean attire that was known of kids at the time. Instead, he was dressed as if he stepped out the late 1800s, wearing a collared shirt and a dirty vest, along with a flat cap. Still, David was more intrigued by the kid than frightened, and merely asked him if he was lost. The boy, with his head held low, with the tip of his cap covering his eyes, lightly nodded at the question. At this moment, David became increasingly anxious, as if a clouded aura surrounded he and the boy all of a sudden, an energy that permeated all around them. Suddenly, the boy addressed David in an eerie, monotone voice, demanding that David take him home to his parents. David was starting to get a little freaked out at this point, so David kindly declined and mentioned that he barely knew him, and that maybe they could hang out another time to get to know each other. However, the boy didn't waver in his demands. He insisted once again that David bring him to his house. He wasn't kindly asking permission. He was forcibly demanding David. Then, the boy lifted his head up slightly, revealing pitch-black eyeballs that caused David's heart to sink deep into his stomach. Once again, the boy said,
"You will take me to your home. Now."
Then he stepped toward David, and in a moment of sheer panic, David turned around and ran as fast as he could, electing to take the long way home in hopes of avoiding another petrifying encounter with the boy. Luckily, David never saw the boy again, but it's still a memory that haunted him for the rest of his life. But David wouldn't be the last to have such a terrifying encounter, for there were many more people that would end up coming across the fabled black-eyed children. What's up, guys? My name's Andrew, and I run the Scare Mail channel, and today we're gonna dive deep into several disturbing cases of the mysterious black-eyed children. They're also known as BEKs, and their sightings date back decades, and some are as recent as just a couple years ago. Now, these are no ordinary children by any means. They're known to provoke inescapable fear and dread for all those that come across them. Some say they're demonic beings, others claim they're aliens in disguise, but one thing's for sure, you do not want to come across whatever these things are, because our last story at the end of the video highlights some of the fatal consequences one may face if you happen to let them in. But first, just a reminder that if you like ghosts, aliens, cryptids, and other supernatural scary stories, feel free to subscribe to the channel with bell notifications to ensure that your scare mail continues to get delivered. Now without further ado, let's get on with the story. On a seemingly ordinary night in Abilene, Texas, a journalist by the name of Brian Bethel found himself parked outside a movie theater. Being a movie critic, Brian was finishing up a movie review for the newly released Mortal Kombat movie when he noticed two figures out the corner of his eye. Brian looked over to see two boys standing shoulder to shoulder as they approached the window of his car. They were both wearing hoodies that covered their eyes, and even more strangely, their clothes were unusually dirty, as if they had been standing outside in the rain for an extended period of time. One of the boys slowly raised his hand and lightly knocked on the window before the other boy plainly asked to let them in. Like any sane person, Brian prepared to lower the window to speak to him until an instinctual urge told him not to. So, Brian kept the window up and asked what they needed help with. Again, in the same eerie monotone voice, the boys requested to be let in the car, stating that they were in danger. Despite this cry for help, there was just something about the boys that really creeped Brian out.
An alarm was going off in his head to not let them in, that he was in grave danger if he gave in to their demands.
So, Brian kindly refused the boys and said he couldn't help, and just as he was about to drive away, one of the boys slammed his fist against the car window, demanding to be let in.
"You have to let us in,"
the boy reiterated, and he hit the window with such force that his hoodie slid off the top of his head. And that's when Brian saw the boy's eyes. Eyes that were so black and lifeless, it were as if a black hole had swallowed all the humanity from the child. Suddenly, Brian noticed his hand reaching for the door handle against his will,
So he slammed on the gas pedal
and drove away as fast as he could. And as he drove away, he looked in the rearview mirror to see if the boys were chasing after him, only to not see them at all. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. Brian told his story on a forum online, and to his surprise, he encountered others that had come in contact with the mysterious children. After this, a wave of stories started to flood in, and the BEK phenomena was only just beginning. Now, our next tale comes from a woman named Rachel, who was out walking her dog late one night in a quiet suburb in New York. Rachel and her dog were on the tail end of their venture and were almost home until she noticed something unsettling. The dog began to growl, pointing its nose at a dark corner of an alleyway in between houses. Upon further inspection, she noticed a little girl standing eerily still in the darkness. Rachel decided to walk closer to see if the girl was alright, but something was off about her. Her clothes were tattered and unusually dated, and even weirder was that her dog stopped dead in its tracks, tugging on the leash in the opposite direction of the mysterious little girl. Rachel turned around to see what was up with her dog, and in that moment, Rachel became increasingly unsettled, almost to a nauseating degree. And as she turned back around to face the girl, she was startled to see that she had moved within arm's reach of her. It was at this moment that Rachel noticed her hollow, demonic-like black eyes.
"Can you help me? I'm lost,"
the girl said in an eerily monotone voice. She sounded innocent, but there was just something about her that made Rachel increasingly uncomfortable. She couldn't help but look deep into her eyes that appeared completely void of all life. A petrifying chill gripped her heart as an instinctive fear told her to get away, to run. Rachel's dog began to bark ferociously in defense of its owner, so Rachel slowly backed away and apologized, stating that her dog was getting antsy and needed to be taken home. But the girl didn't like that one bit. She became increasingly pushy with Rachel, demanding that Rachel take her home, or else. The girl began steadily pacing towards Rachel, and in that moment, her dog began pulling Rachel in the other direction, and instead of pulling back on the leash, Rachel ran along with her dog as the girl shrieked in anger. Rachel and her dog ran as fast as they could to their home, but before they could get there, Rachel took one last look behind them to make sure they weren't being followed, only to see nothing but an empty road in their wake. Like many others, Rachel would end up sharing her story online, and in doing so, added her tale to the large pile of sightings for BEKs. Luckily for Rachel, she had her dog with her to help her retreat to her home and escape. But what would have happened if the black-eyed children came straight to your door? Our next few stories cover just that, and you're not going to like the outcome. In 2008, a man by the name of Tom was driving home from work late one night in his quiet, Midwestern town. Now, Tom was exhausted. He had a rough day at work and was even scolded by his boss at one point. So, he put in a few extra hours at the office to get management off his back. It's safe to say Tom was just ready to get home and collapse face first into his bed. But as he was pulling into his driveway, he noticed two small shadowy figures standing on his front porch. Figuring he was just hallucinating from being so exhausted, Tom pulled into his garage and he closed the garage door as he made his way inside. Just as he was about to walk upstairs to get ready for bed, an abrupt knock was heard coming from his front door. Tom immediately became on edge. He figured the two shadows he saw on the porch could be intruders. So, Tom cautiously approached his front door, and without opening it, peeked through the glass window at the top. Scarily enough, the second he peeked through the window, he heard a faint voice through the glass saying,
Can we come in? We're cold and lost.
Tom couldn't identify where the voice was coming from until he looked down to see two pairs of dreadful black eyes staring up right at him. A chill immediately went down Tom's spine. He couldn't help but notice that the kids were unnaturally pale, almost alien to a degree. One of the kids spoke up again in an unusual, unpleasant voice.
We have to come inside. Now.
Figuring that this was possibly a trap, Tom politely refused and mentioned that he was going to call the police. If the children really needed help, the cops would likely sort it out. As Tom dug into his pocket for his cell phone, the other child chimed in, more forcibly this time, stating,
Let us in. We won't hurt you.
This immediately set alarms off in Tom's head. Tom could sense that the kids were trying to let his guard down, so he refused to play ball. Tom pulled out his cell phone and looked down briefly to call 911, and after he did, he looked back up to see the porch completely empty. The black-eyed children had vanished. Tom ended up sharing his story on a paranormal forum, and, of course, came across others that had similar stories, one of which is the next tale on our slate, another example of BEKs coming straight to your doorstep. In a small, unnamed rural town in the year 2015, a woman by the name of Linda was watching TV in her living room, waiting for her husband to arrive, when a soft knock echoed throughout her home. Figuring her husband forgot his keys, Linda quickly made her way to the front door and opened it without a second thought. But unfortunately for Linda, it definitely was not her husband, for who or what was at her door was far more unsettling than she could have ever imagined. The door swung open to reveal two black-eyed children, menacingly standing on the porch. At first glance, they appeared to be siblings, a boy and a girl, in the unusual dirty, tattered clothing that BEKs are known to wear. And even though they looked frightened and cold, Linda felt an instinctual urge to slam the door shut.
We're lost and need help.
They said in unison, in an unsettling tone that rocked Linda to her core. She locked eyes with them, staring into their hollow, black pupils, which immediately filled her with dread.
Linda hesitated and insisted she call child services to assist the kids, until the boy spoke up and said in a harrowing, nightmarish tone,
Please? We just want to play.
At this point, Linda immediately knew something was up, and her instincts were begging her to slam the door in their faces. She did just that, and closed the door before they could get another word in. She locked the door shut and hid in her bedroom until her husband came home. About an hour and a half later, she tearfully told her husband what had happened, and despite being skeptical of the situation, Linda's husband knew something had to have happened for Linda to spiral so dramatically. Linda begged her husband for them to move somewhere far away. She repeatedly mentioned that she no longer felt safe in the home, and in her obsession with the incident, she decided to research other black-eyed children cases. Linda struggled with a chilling thought every night before she went to bed. What would have happened if I let the children in? Well, Linda would end up coming across an old story online, a cautionary tale of what happens when you make the grave mistake of letting the black-eyed children in, and it is terrifying.
Underneath the bright twinkle-brain lights,
One wintry evening in a small rural suburb, a wife was in the kitchen preparing dinner for her husband while he watched television in the living room. Now, the names aren't specified, but for storytelling's sakes, let's just call them Bob and Jane. Bob was sitting on his couch watching Johnny Carson while Jane finished up cooking dinner. And as Bob enjoyed his nightly program, a soft knock was heard behind him coming from the front door. Like most old-time men, Bob yelled to Jane that someone was at the door, and after a beat he realized Jane hadn't listened. Bob cried out to her again as the knocking continued, and still Jane did not answer the door. Understanding that she's probably tending to dinner, Bob decided to get off his fat butt and answer the door. only to be met by a pair of unsightly black-eyed children. Their expressions were completely blank, with their eyes as dark as the night sky.
Can I help you?
Bob asked as he gazed into their hollow, unsettling eyes.
We're lost.
The little girl plainly said.
Can we wait inside with you?
Bob didn't know what to say at this moment. He thought of how to handle the situation, but before he could make a decision, Jane stepped out from the kitchen and saw the two children waiting out in the cold. Without a second thought, Jane immediately invited the children inside. Despite his reservations, Bob stepped aside and the two children walked inside, single file, one by one. They had a seat on the couch as Jane heated up a pot of hot chocolate. And once it was done, Jane stepped out from the kitchen once again, hot chocolate in hand, and poured them some glasses. But as she was doing so, she finally noticed their dreadful eyes.
Eyes so unsettling, it was as if they were staring into Jane's very soul.
Now, Jane's soul was a kind one, so despite being incredibly unsettled by this, she decided not to bring it up and focused on finishing dinner. However, strange complications began to emerge. Jane and Bob were stricken by nausea, headaches, and an overwhelming sense of anxiety all of a sudden. The children were unnaturally calm and silent, sat watching them with their eerie, black eyes, seemingly unaffected by the growing tension in the room. Suddenly, Bob inexplicably fell into a rut. Blood poured from his nostrils as he collapsed backwards into his lounge chair. Jane stormed into the living room to help before things got inexplicably worse. The lights began to flicker and the house began to shake. Jane cried in fear, unsure of what was going on. The little girl stood up, followed by her little brother, and then looked deep into Jane's eyes as the house rumbled.
Our parents have arrived.
The little girl then calmly led her brother out the front door as Jane sheltered in terror next to her ailing husband. Peering out the front door, Jane could see the two children hop in the back of an ominous black sedan, driven by what appeared to be two men in black suits and caps. And as they drove away, the house ceased to shake and the lights returned to normal. Sadly, Bob and Jane never fully recovered from this incident. The story goes that Bob would eventually die of cancer, and Jane shared a similar fate, suffering numerous health issues towards the end of her life. Even more strange is that all but one of their pet cats vanished after the horrifying incident. The one cat that didn't flee was found deceased underneath the couch, with its stomach ruptured, just below where the mysterious girl had been sitting. To date, this is by far the most petrifying encounter anyone has had with the black-eyed children, and highlights the dangerous repercussions of giving in to their demands. And before I go, I'll leave you with this. If you happen to hear a knock at your door late at night, you best not answer it, because if you do, you just may see a pair of pitch black eyes staring right up at you. I think I'm just gonna let that one go. As always, thanks for watching, and good night.